Excerpt from Dustbowl Disaster. Hurricanes, floods, forest fires, earthquakes. Every year, these natural disasters strike somewhere on Earth. But during the late 1920s and 1930s, two disasters of another kind swept the United States, inflicting pain and suffering on its people. These disasters were particularly troublesome because they lasted for years rather than hours or days, creating hardships for thousands upon thousands of people. The first blow was not a natural disaster, but an economic one. This disaster became known as the Great Depression. It began with the crash of the stock market in 1929. The stock market began falling, and by the time it stopped falling, stocks were worth about 20% of their previous value. People lost their life savings, their jobs, and many other possessions. Banks and factories closed. The Great Depression was not limited to the United States. It spread to other countries throughout the world and became the worst economic slump in history. To make matters worse, the second blow to strike during the 1930s dried up the soil just as money dried up during the stock market crash. It affected the southern region of the Great Plains of the United States, covering large parts of Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma, but also stretching throughout the Great Plains and into the prairies of Canada. The disaster was labeled the Dust Bowl, and the period of history became known as the Dirty Thirties. From prosperity to poverty. Farmers in the Great Plains had been prospering for decades before the Dust Bowl struck. World War I, 1914 through 1918, prevented European farmers from growing wheat, so farmers in North America sold their wheat to buyers who shipped it overseas. The demand for wheat drove prices upward. Farmers plowed up more and more of the grasslands to feed the needs of European countries. The farmers of the Great Plains continued to prosper while many others suffered under the Great Depression, but the prosperity would soon end. Plowing up the grasslands to grow more wheat caused two problems that the farmers did not expect. First, it made so much wheat available that the wheat prices began to drop. Storage bins became filled to capacity, and farmers began to dump their harvested wheat onto the ground and onto roads. Second, when the Great Plains entered a period of prolonged drought, plowing up the grasslands caused the fields to dry up. With too little moisture to support crops, the fields were left bare. From one hot summer to another, the sun baked the soil. When the winds increased, the exposed dry dirt was whipped up into dark clouds of choking dust that swept across the land. The thick, billowing walls of dirt hid the sun and forced people to light lamps in the midday darkness. Number 1, Part A. What inference can be made about the relationship between the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl? A. The Great Depression caused the Dust Bowl. B. The Dust Bowl limited the effects of the Great Depression. C. The Dust Bowl affected more people than the Great Depression. D. The Great Depression and the Dust Bowl occurred during the same time period. Part B. Which sentence from the passage best supports your answer in Part A? A. The Great Depression was not limited to the United States. B. The second blow to the strike during the 1930s dried up the soil just as money dried up during the stock market crash. C. The disaster was labeled the Dust Bowl, and the period of history became known as the Dirty Thirties. D. The farmers of the Great Plains continued to prosper while many others suffered under the Great Depression. Number 2. Read the paragraph. From prosperity to poverty. Farmers in the Great Plains had been prospering for decades before the Dust Bowl struck. World War I, 1914 to 1918, prevented European farmers from growing wheat, so farmers in North America sold their wheat to buyers who shipped it overseas. The demand for wheat drove prices upward. Farmers plowed up more and more of the grasslands to feed the needs of European countries. The farmers of the Great Plains continued to prosper while many others suffered under the Great Depression, but the prosperity would soon end. What does the word prosperity most likely mean? A. Disaster. B. Wealth. C. Farming. D. Demand. Number 3, Part A. What inference can be made about what caused the Dust Bowl? A. Falling stock prices caused the Dust Bowl. B. The Dust Bowl was caused by farmers trying to increase their profits. C. The Dust Bowl was caused by the Dirty 30s. D. The Great Depression caused the Dust Bowl. Number 4, Part B. Which two sentences from the passage best support your answer in Part A? A. But during the 1920s and 1930s, two disasters of another kind swept the United States, inflicting pain and suffering on its people. B. It began with the crash of the stock market in 1929. C. The disaster was labeled the Dust Bowl, and the period of history became known as the Dirty 30s. D. Farmers plowed up more and more of the grasslands to feed the needs of European countries. E. Plowing up the grasslands to grow more wheat caused two problems that the farmers did not expect. F. Second, when the Great Plains entered a period of prolonged drought, plowing up the grasslands caused the fields to dry up. Number 5. When did the stock market crash? A. 1918, B. 1929, C. during the Dirty 30s, D. after the Great Depression.